Should we have religiously focused parties? And should politicians pursue religious policies first and foremost? That's a resurgent question in the light of Fatima Payman and her defection from the Australian Labor Party, primarily in relation to pro-Palestinian policies. Now, the background for anyone who has missed it is that the Greens moved a motion in Parliament to recognise the Palestinian state. At the time, Fatima Payman was an ALP senator. She voted against the ALP and with the Greens, and voted in favour of the motion. This triggered recriminations within the ALP, given that it violated a long-standing rule of party solidarity. This is especially the case given that Fatima Payman doubled down on her stance after being suspended from the ALP caucus for 1 week. Thereafter, she was indefinitely suspended. She then resigned from the ALP, alleging that she was being intimidated because she had to play by the same rules as everyone else apparently. Apparently, having to play by the same rules and being treated equally is now intimidation. Nevertheless, she resigned from the ALP, and there's now been talk of her forming her own party. Primarily, it seems, a party to prioritise and promote Muslim-orientated issues, such as those are. Now, to be clear, I'm not necessarily convinced that party solidarity is necessarily a good thing. It leads to large voting blocks, and it leads to members of parliament not necessarily representing their own communities. And as the ALP and the Liberals have shifted closer and closer together, it also leads toward a uni-party. I would prefer, for example, senators and representatives to represent electorates and to depart from bad party policies, rather than feeling beholden to go along with a clearly stupid idea, which has sometimes been the case, such as is always the case with the ALP, it appears. Now, this of course would create more gridlock. Parliament might be less likely to actually achieve anything when you have various different politicians voting their own way. However, to my mind, this is actually a good thing, because these days politicians appear to simply make things worse. So the less they can achieve, the better. And if that also involves departing from party solidarity to achieve less in Parliament, that might actually be beneficial because it stops politicians harming us all. Now, this then is the question of Fatima Payman. She defected from the ALP over a Muslim-centric issue, being Palestine. The Greens moved the motion. However, Fatima Payman has declined to join the Greens. Now, of course, the majority of people backing Palestine are Muslim, even though the motion in Parliament came from the Greens. And to some extent, backing Palestine has become a defining goal of the Australian Muslim community at the moment, at least if the Muslim Vote organisation is to be believed. Now, of course, we can't just conflate Palestinian issues with Muslim issues, and there's no homogeneous mass of Muslim voters, because different Muslim voters might have different priorities. Many might be concerned with their day-to-day exigencies of life, rather than particularly religious issues. Furthermore, some might argue that the Palestinian cause is a human rights cause and not a Muslim cause. However, as indicated, the majority of proponents are Muslim or are Muslim organisations, such as the Muslim Vote. And the Muslim Vote appears to be conflating being Muslim with supporting Palestine, which is not necessarily the case. If you construct a Venn diagram, for example, of Palestinian supporters and of Muslims, there might be some significant overlap, but it would not be one for one. For example, the Greens are going around supporting Palestine, but many of the Greens are not Muslim. Furthermore, many Muslims might not support Palestine or Hamas. For example, Hamas has been a thorn in the side of many other countries. Iran has been a thorn in the side of many of its Muslim neighbours, such as Saudi Arabia. So it would be a mistake to conflate the two, and it would be a mistake to assume that all Muslim voters would vote in the same way or care about the same issues or hold the same beliefs, much like it would be a mistake to assume that all Catholics have the same belief system as well. Nevertheless, with Fatima Payman's defection, there have been calls for her to establish a Muslim party to champion issues broadly supported by the Muslim community, supposedly anyway. Given that she is a sitting senator, she would be able to fast-track the party creation process, and it goes significantly easier and smoother than if she was sitting outside of the Senate, because sitting outside of the Senate they would need to go and collect several signatories to go and actually form a party. But when a senator tries to do so, it is fast-tracked. Now naturally, if there were a Muslim-focused party, it would pursue policies supported by the majority of Muslim voters, one would imagine. However, of course, there are several issues, including the fact that many Muslim voters might have different priorities, and conflating being Muslim with supporting a party pursuing ideological and religious causes is not necessarily the same. Nevertheless, we've got a couple of things to consider. First, and to be somewhat sympathetic to parties of this type, people should have representatives that represent their interests, rather than just representing a party line, which might not be in their interests. People shouldn't be forced to tolerate representatives that act against them. This is the case whether it's the coalition or the ALP. Now, the ALP, for example, is infamous for having expectations that people should just throw themselves under the bus in support of the ALP's policies. The ALP is infamous for attempting to guilt-trip people into being shafted. Basically say that the Liberals are somehow imperfect, and therefore, if you aren't all in on the ALP's policies, even if they're stupid, then you are somehow supporting the nasty Liberals. The superciliousness of the ALP really grates me. They're like, if you don't acquiesce to us seizing your assets or steamrolling over you, then you're a bigot for supporting the coalition. I loathe the ALP. I loathe their duplicitous guilt-tripping and their gaslighting. However, it's not as if the coalition is actually perfect. The coalition does a bit of this as well, albeit perhaps a little bit less obviously than the ALP, given that the coalition allows its own backbenchers to vote in whichever way that they want. Furthermore, and secondly, I'm not really keen on religiously motivated policies. Now, while I do think that voters should have representatives that represent them, I'm not necessarily super keen on all of the laws being somehow informed by particular religious doctrine. To be clear, as well, Muslims, like I've indicated multiple times, are not a homogenous group. They are absolutely people who are culturally Muslim, like there are people who are culturally Catholic or culturally Anglican. Similarly, there are moderate Muslims and pluralistic Muslims, and Muslims who don't necessarily want everyone else to believe the same thing. However, there are also more extreme versions, such as the theocracy in Iran, and it would be a mistake to assume that that simply doesn't exist. Rather, we have to treat the policies on their own merits. My advice to people like Fatima Payman or to the Muslim Vote Organization would be to avoid appearing to push Muslim religious values onto non-Muslims, as that's going to trigger a backlash, and it would look as if they are trying to dictate their views to everyone else, and to force a particular religious doctrine onto everyone else. They should avoid doing so if they want their party to have any form of longevity and to not result in a backlash. But they are well within their rights to pursue whichever policies they feel best represent their beliefs. So how then do we reconcile the need for people to have representatives that reflect their interests with avoiding a theocracy? Well, in short, there's no easy way to do this in a democracy. Because in a democracy, people can vote whichever way they want. And if there's an increasing number of Muslim people in Australia, then they might naturally vote for representatives that represent what they want to see in a parliament. Now, in theory, this could also result in theocratic policies. However, it would be ideal to try to resist that. And I'm sure that the majority of Muslims, especially those that have fled theocracies, would reject such policies. However, of course, there is a section of the community that does pursue religious hegemony. And it's important to be able to point that out while avoiding tarring all people with the same brush. Therefore, what we really need is both an effective opposition that points out the problems with having theocratic policies and theocratic laws and having religion unduly influence the legislative process, and therefore effectively pushes back against such parties when they go too far. It's incumbent upon the other politicians and also other interest groups to highlight the issues with religion taking too much precedence within policy setting. Now, of course, I'm sure that some people might argue that immigration is underscoring the rise in the amount of Muslim voting. That, however, is a slightly separate policy issue from what we're talking about right now, the right settings in relation to immigration and how that should be conducted. The other area that needs attention is the High Court, and the High Court needs to uphold constitutional protections if they are at risk of being violated. This could, in theory, involve invalidating policies that might violate the separation of religion and state such as it exists in Australia, which admittedly exists to a much weaker extent than it does in the United States. It should also, to my mind, involve stopping the state from expropriating people's assets, which include their cash flow rights. That's something that is often overlooked. An asset involves the cash flow rights underlying that asset. And if the state moves to seize those cash flow rights, then they are effectively seizing part of the asset. The court needs to step in and stop that from occurring. The problem is that the democracy has started to entail the dominant political party, which might not even get the majority of the primary vote, forcing its views onto the minority. The problem as well is that democracy is involved into a numerically greater number of people being able to vote to take away the rights or the assets of a numerically smaller number of people. It's clearly cynical and creates a major problem at the moment. In the end, this will just lead to tit-for-tat policy wars. People need to respect each other's individual autonomy. And unfortunately, there's too many people, too many politicians, and too many voters that don't respect autonomy and feel that they have the right to control what everyone else does, or that they feel they have the right to control someone else's assets or their rights or the way they move around freely within society. But as it stands, a party focused on religious issues could easily get off the ground, and it's incumbent upon other people to point out some of the issues that might arise with this, and to have the guts to do so. Nevertheless, let me know your thoughts about the possibility of a Muslim party in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear what you think.